Hello, my name is Louise Thorn, and as you can see, I'm based at the Centre for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine at Imperial College London. And in my PhD, I'm working also in collaboration with the Science Museum London, which luckily is next door, so I don't have to go too far for my meetings. And this question that I've got here, how can scholarship concerning trust in science be presented to a non-specialist audience within a museum setting, forms very much the core theme of my PhD thesis. But before I talk in more detail about my topic, I'd just like to give you some background to my project and where it comes from. To begin with, my work is funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council, the AHRC, which set up this collaborative doctoral award in 2005, whereby students such as myself could conduct their research between universities and public institutions, such as museums, libraries, art galleries and archives. So my PhD is just one example of many other similar projects right across the UK with a number of different universities and museums. And this particular collaborative scheme has several objectives. Firstly, it enables students like myself to gain practical experience of working with such institutions and to access historical collections and technical resources that perhaps wouldn't normally be available in a traditional university setting. Secondly, in contrast to the usual closed world of academic scholarship, where scholars present their work to their peers, such as this conference kind of thing, the scheme enables researchers to present their work to the public using these institutions as an interface. And perhaps in a more pragmatic way, it's a way of making government-sponsored scholarship more accessible and more available to those who've effectively paid for it. And finally, on a more sort of grand scale, it's hoped that this collaboration will enrich the cultural fabric of the country with this cross-fertilisation of skills and knowledge between the academic and public sectors. So it's quite an ambitious project. And we're hoping to have a conference in London this time next year when all the PhD students on this collaborative scheme will get together and discuss their experiences. So that's the background to my work. And the background to the scheme rather, more specifically for me, my particular brief is to take ideas from the scholarship in the history of science and translate these concepts into ideas that could be used in a potential museum exhibition. Some museum displays are based on particular collections of objects that might have been donated to the museum or that were there at the very origins of the museum. Whereas in this case, I'm looking at the literature first and then looking at the collections of in this case, the Science Museum, and picking out relevant objects that relate to what's happening in the scholarship. This isn't an entirely new concept. There have been several museum exhibitions based on historical scholarship then applied to artefacts, such as the Empires of Physics exhibition at the Museum of History of Science in Oxford, or perhaps more well known is the Science and American Life exhibition at the Smithsonian back in the 90s. So while the Science and American Life exhibition chose a broad theme of the role of science in society, I wanted to choose a topic that was more indicative of the workings of science. How do scientists work together? What kind of decisions they have to make? And how I could possibly create an exhibition that provided an insight into these processes. And this idea stems very much from a lot of recent work in the last 20 years or so by people like Bruno Latour, Harry Collins and Stephen Shapin, looking at quite a deep level at how does science actually work. And perhaps at its essence is how do scientists decide which new ideas to accept or reject. Okay, so using trust in science and more specifically trust between scientists themselves as my overarching theme, I then decided to use this for my exhibition, and I think trust between scientists is a good topic for an exhibition for a couple of reasons. Mainly, I think that it's quite an accessible topic for general audiences because it's based on human experiences, perceptions, ideas about behaviour, rather than very nitty-gritty sort of technical detail. So it has that appeal of everyday relevance and experience. We've all had to make decisions based on trust in our own lives. Also, I think it's a subject that perhaps hasn't been covered quite so much in museums before, so there is a novelty in a sense. Trust in science and trust between scientists is obviously quite an elusive and quite a hidden topic. It only really comes to light if trust is questioned or disputed. And science museums have more traditionally focused on discovery, invention, progress, and more sort of national achievements, whereas science centres at the other end of the spectrum have gone more for experiential kinds of science and looking at scientific principles. So hopefully this historical scholarship-based display will create a more human and more social narrative that will be appealing to perhaps more audiences. Also, on a more local perspective, the new science curriculum for 14 to 16-year-olds in the UK has a new requirement that students should learn about how science works. And this is in terms of critically evaluating data, looking at data sources, and having an awareness of the peer review process. So I think it's really good that students are looking at science sort of critically, but also looking at how it works as well. So I think this topic of trust between scientists dovetails quite neatly into this new agenda and this new idea. So I'll just start with a little bit of methodology. So in the first year of my PhD, I reviewed the literature on trust between scientists. And then in my second year, I focused more on particular case studies to produce a final shortlist of 6 stories that could be used for a hypothetical museum exhibition. So this exhibition won't actually be produced, but I'm just outlining ways in which it could be done and what are the advantages or benefits of using this topic. I also considered looking at more discussions on public trust of scientists, covering many of the topics that we've seen in the conference over the past 2 days. So issues such as climate change, nanotechnology, genetically modified food, nuclear power, and so on. And while these topics are very relevant, I felt that these have been covered in some ways by quite a few museums before. And also, it was also more representative of the science communication or science studies literature rather than the historical literature, which is my primary focus. So, although I was very interested in public trust of scientists, I decided to focus my exhibition purely on trust between scientists. So, that was the rationale for my choice of trust between scientists. So I'd just like to briefly mention some of the themes that I extracted from the literature on trust between scientists, and hopefully later on you'll see how these themes were then incorporated into my choice of case studies and my exhibition. So I initially reviewed some of the main works on the general nature of trust by scholars such as Nicholas Luhrmann or Barbara Meisdahl. And then I focused more specifically on the history of science literature, which was quite a challenge in that trust between scientists is a topic that's rarely addressed in a very explicit way. It's usually inferred to, or it's sort of there as an undercurrent in a lot of historical papers and case studies, but it's quite rare to find a paper that directly addresses it. So despite this, I managed to find quite a few papers and case studies about trust between scientists. And I set up these 3 categories as a way of sorting through the different kinds of scholarship. And many case studies can fit into either one or more of these categories. They're not concrete, as you will see later on. So the first category I have is trust between scientists as individuals, and this is particularly relevant for works such as Schaffer and Chapin's Leviathan and the Air Pump, or Chapin's A Social History of Truth, looking at figures such as Robert Boyle in the Royal Society during the 17th century, and how his persona as the president of the Royal Society and his status as the Earl of Cork gave him a credibility and a trustworthiness. So he was trusted by his fellow gentlemen philosophers, partly because of his social status. And Schaffer and Chapin's work also discusses how the Royal Society provided a forum where gentlemen philosophers could discuss and debate their ideas without fear of reprisal. Previously, if you'd doubted a gentleman philosopher's ideas, it would have been seen as a slur on his honourable reputation, which often led to a duel. So if you wanted to discuss ideas about natural philosophy in a safe environment, you could display your work at the Royal Society. So there's ideas of testimony as well, of having this space where you can demonstrate your experiments, and your fellow gentlemen philosophers can view these experiments for themselves and can accept your ideas. For my second category, I've got trust between scientists within an institution. So this is looking at how trusting in your scientific competence may be implied by your educational background or your institutional affiliation. So perhaps scientists at more well-established, prestigious institutions may be more trusted than, say, those perhaps from lesser well-known places. Also, some work by Andrew Warwick on mathematical training at Cambridge in the late 19th century also describes how having this shared common experience of going through the same training can actually create a network of trusty colleagues that you're then dependent on for the rest of your career. And then for my final category, I've got trust between scientists within the scientific community. There's less material available for this category, but it mainly revolves around issues of peer review and discussions of whether this is a credible process, is it potentially biased, what role does it have to play, and does it actually encourage fraud perhaps? So that's more recent work, and the case studies in that particular section are more based on recent case studies rather than historical examples. Okay. So, having considered many different aspects of the literature on trust between scientists, I then chose several case studies that illustrate different facets of this scholarship. And I chose 6 case studies to create a chronological display of this topic. So the first one, making ideas visible, this is based on my previous mention of the Royal Society and Robert Boyle, and the idea of witnessing experiments for yourself, having a place where experiments can be demonstrated, and where these events can also be recorded and later disseminated by having written accounts of these demonstrations being sent out from London across the UK and across Europe. So this particular case study is very much about testimony, display, and having an arena where these ideas can be discussed. My second case study, moving along chronologically then, is persuading an audience to trust science. And this concerns the rise of scientific lectures around 1800, particularly in London, where science is now transposed from being a very elite, specialised knowledge into something that is brought into the public sphere through these lectures and demonstrations, where science is promoted for both its practical value in terms of perhaps using knowledge of chemistry to enhance agriculture, but also in terms of a social and moral improvement, having science as a way of learning about the world around you. So these lectures were a way of generating trust both between scientists or natural philosophers and between the public sphere. And many lecturers at this time gained a lot of credibility for their work because of their public presence and public visibility through doing these lectures. And 2 key examples of this would be Humphrey Davy and Michael Faraday at the Royal Institution, and how their visibility as highly respected public science lectures made them into credible public experts who often consulted during legal trials during this period. Then for my third case study, I've got Can We Believe What We See in the Heavens? This is mainly based around the idea of Percival Lowell and the canals on Mars in the 1890s. And it's quite a fundamental question in that if an astronomer reports that he can see canals on Mars, how can you trust that observation is correct, or whether they were perhaps seeing optical effects, or whether this is a genuine phenomenon. So this is all about credibility and also how Lowell tried to persuade people to accept his ideas. And it's interesting that Lowell promoted his ideas about canals on Mars very strongly in the public sphere. He gave public lectures, he published many popular science books, and this visibility in the public sphere, while that enhanced his own reputation as the public expert on Mars, it actually damaged his credibility within the astronomical community itself. Then the next category I have is reputations at stake, and this concerns the reception and discovery of both X-rays and N-rays in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So you have these two new forms of radiation. Both forms of radiation, both X-rays and N-rays, were discovered by prestigious physicists. Both discoveries were published in peer-reviewed journals. Both discoveries were claimed to be replicated by other physicists, and yet within a very short time after the discovery of N-rays, it was found that N-rays were actually a delusional effect, or perhaps possibly even an optical illusion. So why did physicists accept these phenomena and then later reject one and accept the other? So why do we still use X-rays today but not N-rays? So that's a case study for there. Then we've got trusting the expert. This is about Arthur Eddington, who was an avid believer in Einstein's general theory of relativity, and undertook an eclipse expedition in 1919 to get the observational data to prove this theory. And when he came back and presented his work was hardly disputed, because Eddington was one of the very few people in Britain at the time who had the specialist knowledge to actually understand the theory. So the other physicists were not able to replicate Eddington's work and had to trust very much in his expertise and in his reputation. He'd already established himself as the British expert on relativity by publishing the key textbook on the subject that was used at this time. So while other physicists could not replicate Eddington's work, and the eclipse is a one-off event after all, they had to very much trust in his ability and his expertise. And then for my final case study, I've got continuing uncertainty. And this is about the search for gravity waves, and how initial reports of an experiment in the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, produced a flurry of sort of copycat experiments where physicists were trying to copy the results to see if they could get the same effects, but they were all in vain. And so the scientist who originally proposed this experiment, Joseph Weber, was sort of criticised within the physics community and later even ostracised from publishing about this work. But there has been more recent work on the search for gravity waves, and it'll be interesting to see whether any later work will maybe vindicate Weber or not, or whether it be completely different. So I wanted to choose that case study because it's bringing the uncertainty and the ideas up to date. So those are my 6 case studies. For the purposes of assessment, I wanted to create 2 display cases about these topics. So I chose the case study of the canals on Mars and the scientific lectures as my two key case studies. And I chose these mainly because there are quite a few objects in the Science Museum collections that are relevant to these topics. So it was easier to choose a topic that had lots of artifacts than to choose one that did not. So over the past 2 months, I've been busy preparing text, images and objects for display. And I created these 2 mock-ups in our PhD office. So if you see here on the left, this is about the canals on Mars. And as you can see, I've got some pictures, I've got copies of some sketches made by Lowell, and some other artifacts at the front. And then again for scientific lectures. I mean, I haven't got the actual artifacts here, they're still in storage at the Science Museum. These pieces of paper actually represent some of the objects. But I found this a really useful way of just getting an idea in my head of how this might potentially work. So for evaluation purposes, I'm inviting groups of curators and historians of science to participate in group focus interviews, where I'll lead a discussion about whether these case studies accurately reflect the historical scholarship, whether they believe I've taken the right themes or whether I've missed out key themes, or whether there are ways I can improve the themes that I have chosen. And I'm hoping to later on try this with museum visitors and science teachers, particularly those who are doing the How Science Works syllabus that I mentioned earlier. I think this would be really relevant for perhaps teaching this topic. So that's my mock-up. And then I'd just like to conclude. I just want to summarise a few key points that I've encountered whilst conducting this project. I don't know if anyone here is doing any sort of similar work or has students who are doing similar projects, but there are some points that I might like to mention. Intellectually, it's been quite challenging in that I've had to familiarise myself with quite a broad swathe of literature, from the history of science itself to all the sort of museological literatures as well on interpretation, material culture, museum education and visitor research. So it's been quite an intensive and sort of steep learning curve. The topic of trust itself is also highly intangible to display. I mean, it's a very social concept, and there are very few objects that directly relate to aspects of trust, such as prestige, reputation, personality, testimony. It's quite challenging to find artifacts. And it's particularly challenging when you consider that the Science Museum has over 125,000 objects in its collection, and yet I have still really struggled to find something. So it shows how difficult this topic is. Also, many of the artefacts that I have found from the collections are mainly sort of pictures and images, two-dimensional, which perhaps is not surprising in that historians tend to focus mainly on text and images for their research. So if you're translating research that's been conducted using text and images, it's very difficult to translate that to objects. And this suggests that perhaps if we want to create museum exhibitions that are based on historical scholarship, perhaps we need a closer collaboration between historians and curators right from day one, and have historians working on the objects at the very beginning of their research, rather than trying to map back from the historical scholarship to the object. And also, many of these pictures and objects that are available do require quite detailed explanation and contextual context within the label, in that it's not always immediately apparent from the picture or from the text what this means in terms of trust. It's quite difficult to tease out the trust from the actual object or image. However, despite these challenges, I believe that this approach is a valuable means of drawing public attention to the academic scholarship in the history of science. And it also opens up some of the black box of the workings of science that are normally hidden from view. We tend to see the end product of science rather than the actual process. And I believe that this project will provide valuable material for quite a sophisticated and thought-provoking museum exhibition. Thank you.